China is now deeply involved in this war. I would go so far as to say that this is the first proxy war between US and China ever. Trump cannot back down because then he will be the first president to actually be dealt a defeat at the hand of China. And I think that will be something not only will be unacceptable for Trump, it will be unacceptable for all the neocons, the military, the industrial complex around him. The only option left on the table is an amphibious assault on the Iranian coastline around the Bandar Abbas, because that's the only way they're going to be able to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And I think you're going to talking about a very risky operation. If you see a sudden basically rise in casualties, that's when the stock market will realize that then the US can no longer disengage. Even the bite on dip retail investors will have to basically get out. The US is actually being, outplayed a little bit. And I think that is my biggest concern. When the hegemon is actually playing the chess badly, it may overreact. When it overreacts, that's when you get war. And then a big war, because then you've got nothing to lose.
A bigger war? Does that mean more participants? Does that mean China getting involved directly? Does that mean Russia getting involved directly?
This power struggle between the unipolar world versus the multipolar world is very bullish for gold.
This is The Real Story with Michelle Makori.
We are now 3 weeks into the conflict with Iran, and markets may still be dangerously underestimating what comes next. Because according to today's guest, this is a conflict that the market is still mispricing, and it is the biggest factor driving equities, commodities, and the economy. David Woo is one of the most respected macro strategists to come out of Wall Street. He's the former head of global rates, FX, and emerging market strategy at Bank of America. He also held senior roles at Barclays and Citigroup, and was also an economist at the IMF. David Woo built his reputation making bold, out-of-consensus calls, from forecasting Donald Trump's 2016 election victory to identifying major macro turning points before they became obvious to the markets, like the post-COVID rebound. And today he runs his independent platform, David Woo Unbound, a global macro advisory firm where he advises some of the world's largest institutions with a combined $3 trillion in assets under management. And his warning is now clear: the market is still treating a broader escalation in this conflict as a tail risk, when in reality, it is fast becoming a central scenario. And if he's right, the implications are significant for oil, for equities, for commodities, and for the global economy. So, is the market still a little too complacent? David is also the author of Merry-Go-Round Broke Down, a novel of guilt, greed, and globalization, set to be released on March 31st. It explores how money, power, and policy intersect, and how decisions made at the highest levels of finance and government ripple through the global economy. David, very good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
David, we will discuss your book towards the end of this interview, but for now, we want to focus on your core thesis, and I believe that is that the market is still not assessing the Iran war accurately. Make your case.
Yeah, I think, there's no doubt. I mean, I just look at my own clients. I mean, forget about price action. I think the consensus for the last 3 weeks has been that Trump is going to tackle. That's it. I think Trump tackled so many times in 2025, and so many people lost so much money when he did tackle. Nobody wanted to be short the stock market, thinking.
And for those not familiar, taco Trump always chickens out. For those not familiar with that, so Trump backing down is what we mean when we say Trump taco. But carry on, please.
Yeah. So, for example, a week ago when Trump said, "Wow, the war is nearly complete, that we're going to be done very soon," that just reinforced, I think, the consensus in the market that when tough gets going, Trump is just going to run away, from the scene of the crime. So I think this is what's been going on. But yet I think that, yeah, history has a tendency to repeat itself, but only when the conditions remain the same. I just think that the conditions right now are very different than any conditions we've seen actually in Trump's first year in power. And I think from that point of view, let me tell you why I think Trump, the window for taco is over, actually, that Trump is now very dug in. I mean, there are several reasons for this. One of which is that I think China is now deeply involved in this war. In fact, I would go so far as to say that this is the first proxy war between US and China ever. The reality is that I mean, this was not that obvious because you might have thought that the first conflict was going to be between U.S. and China over Taiwan. Who would have thought it was going to be Iran? And this is the reality. After China was very hesitant to provide Iran with a strategic backstop until very recently, but Trump's unilateral actions against Venezuela has caused China to reassess. As a result, over the last basically few months, we've seen increasing signs of essentially deepening involvement of China in Iran, such as, we know that Iran largely rebuilt its missile stockpile over the last 6 months because of assistance from China. We know that they have deployed, advanced Chinese radars that are capable of detecting, stealth aircrafts like the B-2 bombers and the F-35s. We know that they've been talking to the Chinese about buying anti-ship supersonic missiles that can hit U.S. aircraft carriers. And then there's no question, even just last week, we had confirmation from the Iranian foreign minister who said that they're getting, cooperation from China, even when it comes to satellite intelligence. Just to give you a sense to what extent the satellite intelligence they're getting from the Chinese is proving to be very decisive in this war so far. And I think Trump clearly was unprepared for this, which is the fact that, just the last 2 weeks, we have reports of multiple radars, of the U.S. air defense radars across the region being damaged or taken out, and so on and so forth. We've had reports from Wall Street Journal last week that 5 U.S. refueling planes were damaged in an attack against a Saudi airport. We just had today another basically report that the USS Lincoln is now pulling away from, essentially Iran towards the Indian Ocean following a missile attack from Iran. And then just earlier this week, we had U.S. as another aircraft carrier, Gerald Ford, which is the most advanced aircraft carrier ever the U.S. has actually made. Guess what? Apparently there was a mysterious fire, on the boat that actually injured 200 sailors, and now the boat is going to Crete, in the Mediterranean for repair. So all of this, I suspect, it couldn't have been done without intelligence assistance from the Chinese. So the point here, what I'm trying to say here, because this is a proxy war between the U.S. and China, Trump cannot back down, because then he will be the first president to actually be dealt a defeat at the hand of China. And I think that will be something not only will be unacceptable for Trump, it will be unacceptable for all the neocons, the military, the industrial complex around him. That alone would suggest that Trump has to keep going. Because the point here is that Trump can only he can only get out when he's still ahead. He's not ahead anymore, which means he has to keep going until he gets ahead. Unfortunately, the problem is right now, to get ahead, he will have to take more risk. And my view is that the only option left on the table is an amphibious assault on the Iranian coastline around the Bandar Abbas, because that's the only way they're going to be able to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And I think you're going to be talking about a very risky operation that will involve a lot of casualties on the part of America. I think the first casualty, if you see a sudden basically rise in casualties, that's when the stock market will realize that then the U.S. can no longer disengage. Even the buy on dip retail investors, I think at that point, will have to basically get out, because the implications should be very, very obvious to everybody by then.
All right, so 2 major points to unpack there, and we'll go back to the amphibious assault and what that could mean and how that could trigger the markets. But you're basically saying that this is a proxy war between the US and China, an angle that has not been covered in the mainstream media, certainly not in the pro-Trump camp in the mainstream media, but also in the anti-Trump camp in the mainstream media. We're not really hearing this China angle. Now, granted that news sources, depending on where you are in the world, give you different information, but what is the strongest concrete evidence that you have that China is materially supporting Iran over here?
Right. Let's just think about this, right? It's actually very funny, right? Last June, I still remember the Iranians, after having lost the 12-day war, was openly critical of both China and Russia for not having done enough to help. This time, you've got the foreign minister of Iran only 3 days ago coming out in an interview saying Thank you, China. Thank you, basically Russia, for all the help you're giving us, including military cooperation. So I think that in itself, I think is very obvious. Now,
Could,
obviously,
could, could that just be a statement to antagonize, to create doubt? I mean, could that just
uh,
because the Iranian minister says so?
I think I'd be very doubtful that's the case. And again, I think, the point here is that Iran will have no reason to think the Chinese and the Russians, if the war so far has been going pretty well, if they believe that they haven't gotten any help, they will want to take the full credit to basically share the credit of China. And by the way, as you probably know, the only tankers that have been passing through the Strait of Hormuz are Chinese and Russian tankers. That's
Right.
another clear indication. I think, listen, I don't want to say, well, the Iranians don't know what they're doing, that kind of thing. But to be able to take out so many strategic US military assets in the region with so much ease, I can only assume that they have help from the Chinese. Again, we know this for a fact that actually in this war, Iran has migrated from civilian GPS to the Chinese Baidu satellite navigation system. That is probably the reason, and I think I'm not the only one. There are a lot of analysts out there who are talking the same, except, the Wall Street Journal, which is very, very pro-US, doesn't want to talk about it. But the point here is that a lot of people are saying most likely access to Chinese satellite is the reason why that the Iranian missiles and drones have been more accurate and much harder to jam. And this is very, very important.
Well, going into this conflict, there was the theory, there still is the theory that a lot of this has been about actually curtailing China's access to cheap discounted oil. China is the world's largest oil importer. Most of that supply comes from Iran and Venezuela, two countries where the US has now taken or attempting to take control over the oil supplies. And this cheap sanctioned oil has helped Beijing manage energy costs, maintain reliable supply. And there has been this idea that this is about curtailing China's access to energy and thereby limiting its broader geopolitical ambitions, be that to challenge the US dollar, to de-dollarize, be that to curtail its military adventurism with regards to Taiwan. And that is part of the broader agenda here, and keeping in mind that oil is not just a commodity, it's tied directly to the global monetary system through the petrodollar system established when Saudi Arabia agreed to price oil in US dollars, recycle those revenues into US financial markets. And for decades, as background for our viewers, that system created massive global demand for dollars. But in recent years, countries like China, Russia, and Iran have been trying to actively weaken that system. Up until about 2018, 95% of the world's oil was priced in dollars, and you needed dollars to buy oil. And subsequent to that, as of last year, 20% of the world's oil is priced in non-dollars. And to your point, there are also reports that China is getting oil, but that oil is being paid for in yuan, that Iran is letting certain ships go through, provided that payments for that oil is made in yuan. So if this does, so you can see the agenda from the United States that perhaps this was a broader attempt to curtail China. And therefore, it makes sense that you would see China responding here. Do you think that this was one of the underlying factors behind this conflict in the first place?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, except for the fact that it's not true that China imports most of its oil from Iran and Venezuela. It's 5% from Venezuela. It's about 15% from Iran. Actually, believe it or not, China is the biggest oil importer from Saudi Arabia, for example. So but nevertheless, there's no doubt. I mean, I think one sort of historical lesson we want to bear in mind, because this is how the Chinese are probably thinking about this, is this, right? So Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, as you remember, at the start of World War II. Now, the question is why? I mean, were they completely crazy to do something as reckless as attacking Pearl Harbor, which was so far away, and then basically risk essentially bring the U.S. into the Pacific War? The main reason was because 5 years earlier, Franklin Roosevelt had announced a total oil embargo on Japan. If Japan had done nothing at that point, the Japanese economy was just going to collapse overnight. So the Japanese, after 5 days of deliberation, decided to essentially embark on a gamble of a lifetime, which is to attack Pearl Harbor in order to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, so as to give the Japanese time to invade Indonesia and Malaysia to gain access to oil there. Okay. Now, what do you think? What do you think is the main consideration for Beijing when they started on this whole Belt and Road Initiative? Because the whole Belt and Road Initiative was always about building a land bridge from China to the Middle East onto Africa. And the main reason is because China was wary that one day the US is going to do the same to China as it did to Japan, and by imposing essentially choke points on China's access to resources and so on and so forth in order to force China to its knees. And therefore, China was trying to build a land bridge that's parallel to the maritime route to the Middle East onto Africa. So I think from that point of view, this is all about great power struggle. Now, again, I mean, like, I don't really care who wins in the end, but the point here, because I'm in the prediction business, but what is very clear, but, like everything, the whole world could be understood by basically this general framework that we're talking about, the US being a hegemon of yesterday is trying to retain its hegemonic power. China, Russia, and others, and it's not just China and Russia and Iran, India is also there, Brazil there, all the big countries, they don't want to basically be eating, crumb at the US table. They think it's unfair that the US being the hegemon basically gets everything and so on and so forth. So they want to basically have a seat at the table as well. So literally you're talking about, this is about a struggle between the unipolar world dominated by the US versus the unipolar world. And I think, US is trying to outmaneuver China. Again, I mean, under Biden, they were trying to outmaneuver China by, getting Russia, to drag Russia into the Ukraine war, because they thought by weakening Russia, they were going to be able to weaken China's most important ally. Now they're going after Iran for the same reason, because they're going to be able to disrupt China's basically access to oil, so on and so forth, the Middle East and so on and so forth. So I think, and then China is trying to now basically help Iran to stay in the power, which is complicating the whole situation. There's no doubt the general background is this power struggle between, the upstart versus the well-established hegemon. And that, we live in a dog-eat-dog world, and that's what it is. So, and I think, everything we're seeing right now, this is why I'm saying in this war, because this is what this is about, the stakes are so much higher.
Well, let's talk about that amphibious action that you think is going to be necessary, an assault on Bandar Abbas. Why is that the most likely path forward from a military perspective to you, as opposed to continued air or naval pressure? Why is that what you think would be the escalation that you say the markets are now mispricing?
Right. I think the reason is very simple. Okay, we all know, like, I live in Israel. I can tell you, like, something that really
And
struck.
that's an important point, because you're in the part of the world that is getting a lot of the brunt of this conflict, with missiles raining down on Israel. So it actually adds more perspective to your perspective, being there in Israel while this is happening. But go on. So why is
Yeah,
this? I
thank
was
you. I
asking
mean,
about the amphibious assault.
sorry. I'm an American living in Israel of Taiwanese extraction. So I've got a lot of different perspective here that I like to think I'm a bit more objective. But let me tell you, one of the things that I've settled here 5 years ago, and one of the things that really is taking me by surprise, perhaps the biggest surprise of the last 3 years, has been the incredible, the impunity enjoyed by the Houthis in Yemen. It's pretty amazing, because the Houthis also they sit on the mouth of the Red Sea. The Houthis, which are like, they have like 1,000th resources that Iran has at its disposal. When the Houthis wake up every morning, and when they decide they want to shut down the traffic going in and up the Red Sea, they can do what they will. And most importantly, that they can do it with relatively unsophisticated weapons, like, basically speedboats, or sea mines, or very primitive, anti-ship missiles, and so on and so forth. They were able to do it because this is the power of geography. Now, the point, going back to Iran, if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, it's about the same, essentially width at the narrowest point, and also most importantly, that the usable shipping lanes is only about 2 or 3 kilometers. Now, imagine this is the situation. I think Iran all along, understood that the only way they stood any chance against the combined military might of the United States and Israel is by forcing the US and Israel to fight in conditions that will actually neutralize their technological advantage. And then this is the reason why Iran has picked the Strait of Hormuz as the main battlefield, okay? Because in a way, the reason why, so we were saying before, it's the irony is that Trump was saying, oh, well, he was going to send naval ships in there, warships to escort tankers, okay? Not only that has not happened, what's happened, I just told you, 2 U.S. aircraft carriers that were sent to the region have actually been moving away from Iran because they come under attack from basically Iranian missiles and drones and so on and so forth. Okay. The point here is that when you're talking about such narrow shipping lanes, and then the tankers are moving very slowly, when you send warships to escort them, basically they become sitting ducks. And you don't even need missiles to attack them. You just need anything. Sea mines, you could use conventional artillery, you can use drones and so on and so forth. And then I think the reality is that, Trump said, oh, well, we took out 20 of their, basically boats for laying mines. The fact is that what he didn't tell you is that Iran already 2 years ago demonstrated the ability to deploy drones using rockets. What I'm saying to you is that it would be very difficult for them to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, okay, without essentially going in. Now, I'm going to assume that right now, I'm also assuming right now for the time being that they cannot destroy the firepower of Iran just by essentially attacking their position from the air. Because what is going on there is that the Strait of Hormuz actually, if you think about this, on the Iranian coast side, you've got Bandar Abbas, which is the largest city, actually at the Strait of Hormuz, and it sits on a very narrow coastal plain. And behind the narrow coastal plain, you've got this, basically southern ridge, this very mountainous, rugged areas, okay, that provide excellent, basically natural defenses, okay, for the Iranian troops. And then they also have the advantage of sitting above the coastal plain, in fact, 3,000 meters high. And then with which they have absolutely excellent vantage points to point their guns and their missiles, launchers, and everything at any troops coming in. So this is the reason why I think what's going to happen is that you can have no choice but to go in. But the problem is that the coastal plains are very narrow, which means you're not going to be able to land 50,000 Marines. You're probably going to be able to land 10,000, okay? And then it's going to be a very limited space for mass maneuvering. And then they're going to be potentially running against Iranian basically firepower, because the Iranians probably just waiting for the Americans to come, because they believe that if they can inflict enough casualties, Trump will probably have to pull back. So I think this is where it gets complicated. But I do think that as soon as what the Iranians probably don't get is that if the Marines do arrive on these beaches and then enough of them die, actually the market will understand right away that now the U.S. will not be able to disengage from Iran, because then it's going to be like, you know what, we're going to destroy you all the way now. So I think the point, and that will be very negative for the stock market. So I think, honestly, I think this is the only way, because this is even more important than regime change, which is to actually reopen the Strait of Hormuz, because that is what is actually turning the war in Iran's favor, because high oil price is very threatening to the U.S. economy for Trump, because Iran knows he may tackle because forced by oil.
Okay, so what you're saying right now is the market is underestimating the fact that there will be some ground incursion. How successful that'll be another conversation. When we hear of this ground incursion, is that the trigger that you see sends the markets down? Play that out for me.
Yeah, I think that could very well be. I think, this is probably going to be another week, because we know that, Trump has ordered the deployment of the Marines. So I'm assuming right now it's going to be the Marine Expedition, Brigade, which is about 15,000 people. They're on their way. Probably it's going to take another week before they all get there. And meanwhile, they're probably going to bomb the hell out of the whole entire coast in order to soften the firepower of Iranians before they deploy these guys. And in fact, just last night, there were basically reports that the U.S. was using bunker buster bombs, essentially against the Iranian position on that coastline. So it'll be very interesting what happens. Of course, we also know that Israel knows that it's running out of time, because Israel is very worried that Trump is going to tackle, right? Because already you've got all these people saying, oh, well, Israel's dragging the U.S. into war, which is total bullshit, because we know that Trump and BB are talking every single day on the phone. There's no way that Israel would have attacked, the Iranian gas field yesterday without Trump having known about it. But the point here is that there is no question that, that Israel is also in a hurry because they realize if the U.S. walks away, that's it. Okay, if the U.S. walks away, this will be a disaster, not only for Israel, but for the other Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and UAE. This is why these countries want Trump to also finish what he started. But the point here is that I'm going to assume over the course of next week, you will see an intensification, in other words, more risk taking on the part of everybody to basically trying to bring this thing to basically a resolution. And then when you take more risk, when you're trying to expedite the process, obviously, that's when you have very often unexpected outcome, and in good or bad.
And what would that mean again for the markets? What kind of drop down are you forecasting? Are there any particular sectors that are hit worse than others? Are there any particular sectors that do well in this environment?
I think right now it's actually, for me, the most interesting thing is this, right? I mean, like, we don't know what just happened just now as you and I were talking, that, maybe the Japanese and the Europeans have now decided to send worship after all. But I think, there's also the question, I do think that the point here is this, okay? By the end of this week, and we're almost there, okay, we would have lost 10 million barrels of oil a day from the world market, which is roughly around 10%. Okay. And as you and I know, the demand for oil is relatively price inelastic in the short term. In other words, like, so if oil price gone up, whatever, 30%, 40%, whatever, you're not going to stop going to work, or you're not going to stop taking the subway, whatever it is. The world's economy is not going to shut down just because of that. So that means if demand is price inelastic, that means prices will have to basically overreact. Generally speaking, anybody who's been in the forecasting business of oil price will tell you that if you're talking about 10% oil, I mean, that oil probably is going to go to $200 a barrel. So the point here is this. I just think that right now we're at 110, whatever that means. Maybe the market is thinking that Trump is going to basically put in, oil export control, whatever it is. But then Brent is a very different story. I do think another week of this, I think oil price will be substantially higher. And by the way, you probably saw the report that came out earlier this week. So a couple of basically Stanford University professors, they did a very simple back of the envelope calculation. What they show is that if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for just 3 weeks, okay, the cost to U.S. consumers, okay, from higher energy price will more than offset the net financial basically benefit from the increase in tax refund as the result of the big beautiful bill that's now being sent out. So again, you're talking about at the start of the year, everybody was so excited the economy was going to be basically ripping this year because of the tax rebate, this and that. The Strait of Hormuz has already been closed by 2 weeks. One more week, all of that basically fiscal stimulus will be completely wiped out by higher oil price. And if things would drag on any longer, the economy will be slowing, and I think the market will have to come around to that.
Again, so many points to unpack here, but let's focus on what you said about President Trump only being able to back down if he's ahead. What does ahead actually look like in this war now? If this amphibious assault happens, does there need to be the effective reopening of the Strait of Hormuz for there to be a victory declared? What does ahead mean for the president and for the United States right now?
Right. I think there are 2 ways to get ahead. I think one is that because if you don't reopen the Strait of Hormuz, if you don't take it over, then all the entire Gulf states will remain under essentially the Iranian, essentially aggression. So from that point of view, like if the U.S. walks away without essentially destroying Iran's capacity to basically put a stranglehold on the Strait of Hormuz, then the U.S. will be abdicating its essentially its role, decade role as the security guarantor of the region over to China, because all these countries are going to be all started running to basically Beijing, and Trump knows that. So that will be a huge defeat if he doesn't basically take over this. But there's another way to do this, by the way. The only other way to actually, which will be even more absolute, will be, of course, to essentially, somehow manage to get the Iranian people to go in the streets and overthrow the regime. And I think this is not something I would rule out either. This is more complicated because, in order to do that, in order you don't send the Iranian protesters to their early graves, you got to basically make sure that they're safe by the time they enter the streets. In other words, you have to weaken what I call the apparatus of coercion or the infrastructure of oppression, okay, before you actually call on the people that go into the streets. And by the way, this has been the single biggest focus for Israel over the past 2 weeks. The Israeli, basically, essentially air campaign against Iran has been targeting the Basij, the paramilitary group that has been essentially the ones responsible for cracking down, killing protesters back in January and before that. But the point here, I know that they've killed hundreds of them, but the problem, however, is the Basij have built this massive underground tunnel, okay, across all of Iran. And where they're hiding, they come in, they come out, they wear the same civilian clothes. They're not waiting around for the Israelis to drop a bomb on them and so on and so forth. So I think, but this is, while I have less confidence in, in the U.S. simply because of what's been going on in the war in the last 3 weeks, it hasn't been all that inspiring in terms of the U.S. performance. I think Israel so far has not dropped a single ball, and if anybody can pull this off, it will be Israel. I'm rooting for Israel in this, and maybe Israel can come and save the day. And at least that's what I'm. Maybe I'm praying for that.
Pull this off, meaning affect regime change?
Will affect regime change. Because again, once Israel has dealt a big enough blow to this infrastructure of oppression, then the Iranian people are going to be able to come into the streets without fearing for their lives. Okay. Then I think it's going to be a much easier thing. Okay.
Well, who is running Iran now? Because Israel has decapitated so much of the Iranian leadership on various fronts, from the IRGC to the supreme leadership to intelligence to those very forces who have been repressing the people and who have been, as you say, killing protesters well before this war. So who is actually running what's going on in Iran now? Who's actually giving these commands?
I think, we don't know, but all we know is this: the Iranians have said all along that they have literally arranged essentially 5 degrees of successions for every single job. In other words, somebody gets killed, you've got 5 people underneath him who's waiting to get promoted into his place. And also, I think Iran is following a relatively straightforward, battle plan, which is, again, trying to drive up oil price, which means focusing their missiles and drones on attacking the Gulf states, the oil fields, and the Strait of Hormuz. This is also the reason why the attack against Israel has been relatively light. So I think from that point of view, it's not a complicated war plan that they're following, but to the extent it's relatively straightforward, also, I think it's a source of its effectiveness. But I do get your point. But the point is that once people get in the streets, and then, the mobs take over the ministries or whatever, then you can basically bring someone like, Reza, what's his name? The son of the previous Shah, or others like him, because there are a lot of Iranian dissident groups outside Iran that have been planning for their return for many years. So I think that the Iranian institutions are strong enough that I think that should not be too much of a, again, I'm not saying that this is going to be easy at all, but again, but I think this will be, let's put it this way, I think this will be easier than was the case in Syria or in Libya for that matter. Because again, it's a country that has institutions, and you have political dissidents and opposition groups. And then you have people, and then the Iranian people are very educated, unlike the Libyans and the Syrians and so on and so forth. So I want to be hopeful, even though I would urge caution and so on and so forth. A lot of things can go wrong, no doubt about that. But if you ask me what the best scenario is, that will be the best scenario.
But is it more likely that there is this ground offensive by the United States first, and that is the market triggering sell-off event?
Yeah. So I think the way it's going to think about this is like they're going to, they've got another week before the Marines, okay, arrive in the region, let's just say, okay. So they're going to basically wait and see what happens over the next week. Are they going to be able to, essentially somehow stifle the firepower of Iran, essentially on the Strait of Hormuz, okay? or not enough for them to send in the Marines, or that, they're going to see, well, whether they have actually devastated, the Basij, the paramilitary group, enough so that they can actually call a popular protest first. I think, they have two options right now, and which one they're going to go with, obviously, is going to depend on where they're making more progress. And I think that's what's going to happen.
But Marine presence, I get that. That signal, Americans don't like that. And casualties on the ground from Iran, that is definitely not going to be a very politically popular move. It may indeed trigger a market sell-off, as you say. But if it is a successful military initiative, then doesn't that wrap up the war faster? And then therefore, we can, to the US's advantage or goals, bring down oil. It won't look good, and it would be a tragic loss of American lives, but that could ultimately result in this regime change, in this opening of the Strait of Hormuz, and then bringing it back to the markets and the economy. Wouldn't that, if that is successful, make it not a protracted conflict?
Yeah, no, I think that would definitely be the case. But I do think that the market tends to think. I mean, again, if you look at the track record of the United States, whether it's Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq and so on and so forth, which is that you get in, you can't get out, and becomes protracted. Even Carter, the whole hostage rescue thing in 1978. What I'm saying is that, again, this is one of these things that cannot be done that easily. If it were the Israelis, it would be a different story, because the Americans don't have the best track record, and because the American people know that, the military does not have the best track record when it comes to doing this kind of thing. I just think that the market will take it very hard if it believes that, people are going in, that they're going to assume the worst. I think that's what it is. But
Would
but
the
again,
Israelis send in forces then, in conjunction with
I
the
think I
US
think
or
the
alone?
Israelis I think the Israelis are seriously thinking about sending in forces, because they think that if Trump is going to tackle, which will be the worst thing can happen, they might decide that if Trump does not want to put American lives, you know, on the line, the Israelis might decide that they have no choice but to do it. Okay, and I would feel better about that if Israel were to do it anyway. But that's what
Why
it
would
is.
you feel better about that?
Because I just think that if you think about this, like, again, I think the problem with the US, to be honest, I mean, I think a lot of people are not going to say this when I say this, which is that, I think, when Trump went in there, you think, well, the American military is the best, we're the greatest, and this and that. And they go in there, and now that, all these things happen, they call with their pants down, right? Israel has always been a country that's under siege. I mean, Israel is massively outnumbered by enemies, okay, across the entire thing. And Israel has always had to basically make something out of nothing, okay? This country is a great success. I'm not even Jewish. I'm telling you this. I think this country has been a major success only because mother has been, I mean, the necessity has been the mother of invention. This country is created, innovated because it has nothing, okay? And I think from that point of view, Israelis, from that point of view, when they go into war, it's usually after months and months of planning, and everything is thought out, intelligence been gathered for years, and so on and so forth. And this is why I'm a little bit more, I'm sure even Putin is under a lot of criticism in Russia right now. It's about 4 years in. I mean, just think about this. I mean, Russia is like 5 times bigger than Ukraine. They've been at war with Ukraine for 4 years. And then what? Israel was able to take out Khamenei in one day, and then, Zelensky is still basically walking around. You know, I think a lot of countries are looking at the situation and say, wow, listen, very impressed by what Israel's managed to do. And so I think from that point of view, I think Israel has definitely earned, I think, the sort of the reputation that I think, that it has now. Which I think the Israelis never take for granted. Because again, when you are literally, this is literally, if you think about this, Israel has been fighting the David versus Goliath war for much of the history since the War of Independence. And then it's this whole idea that we are small and therefore we have to work 20 times harder than everybody else is what actually sets them apart in the end. And that's what it is.
One of the narratives you touched on before we get back into the markets, one of the narratives you touched on, David, is that there is this idea that Israel forced the US and the Trump administration into this conflict. When you put it in the broader context of what we just discussed, in terms of challenging the the hegemony of the United States by other countries, and perhaps this being a proxy war against that, What do you say to this idea that Israel forced the US into this conflict?
I think it's an anti-Semitic trope. Again, I'm not even Jewish, but when I hear that, it's my blood boils because like it just is so. I mean, it just smacks of anti-Semitism. What you're talking about, like what a country of 10 million people have a huge, massive influence over the decision of a country like what 300 million people, and then the strongest country in the world, the mightiest country in the world, somehow that they all at mercy, and they will basically take orders from little Israel. Are you joking? Listen, also, I mean, even the American Jews, let's be honest here, the majority of Jews out in America vote for Democrats. I mean, do you really believe that Trump is beholden to the Jews? I mean, please do me a favor. I mean, there is no evidence of that. So I would say that all these people like Tucker Carlson, all these people who are now saying, oh, wow, the U.S. is being dragged into this war by the Jews, by basically, they are again playing to this whole idea, this conspiracy of the last 100 years that somehow there's this conspiracy theory that the Jews are in control of this and that. That's bullshit. And then I get disgusted when I hear this because it's so untrue. But the point here is that Trump, as you exactly said, this conflict is about U.S. versus China. They went in there. Trump is going in there to weaken China. Okay, if they lose, it's because their own fault, and that's what it is. So from that point of view, like it's for I mean like I mean I mean as a Chinese person, American living in Israel, having followed the history of the Jews, I mean there's a tendency every time anything that goes wrong anywhere in the world, blame the Jews. Of course,
Well, you,
blame the
you,
Jews.
you do come from this from a very, very unique perspective, as you say. But let's bring it to this idea, and I want to bring it back to the markets, and I want to bring it back to gold. But before we do that, I do think it's important to go back to that framework that you said, and you mentioned the BRICS, and you mentioned that this is pushback against the BRICS trying to dethrone the U.S., dethrone the dollar, and I want to play a soundbite that we heard from President Trump last year when the BRICS were being more active with coming out with their gold backed currency, being more active with saying that they want to challenge dollar hegemony and that they want to dethrone the dollar. And President Trump said it then that this would be like losing a war. And I've always maintained that the US would not let that go without a fight. And I think that perhaps this is that fight or an extension of that fight. I want to play that soundbite for our viewers and for you and get your thoughts.
BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And we're not going to lose the standard at any time. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer. We're not going to let that happen. The dollar, you ever hear the expression, dollar is king? The dollar is king. We're going to keep it that way, okay?
David, is this part of defending the dollar? Is that what this war is about? And what does this mean for the dollar?
I mean, there's no doubt. This is what it is. Because again, it's actually ironic, right? Because the whole global system, of the last 50 years. I mean, the U.S. was the founder, the architect. It was about. In the end, you might say, well, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, they were all inspired by, U.S. idealism to promote democracy and this and that. But in the end, there's also no doubt the U.S. was the biggest beneficiary of the system. Okay. Now, there's no doubt the dollar as the reserve currency was the reward for the U.S. as the architect and the guardians of the system. And we can talk about what that actually means. Like, well, 60% of global trade is invoiced in dollars, 60% of global reserves invested in US dollar. But most of all, the fact that dollar is a reserve currency allows the US to run bad policies that other countries would not get away with. I mean, there is no other country in the world that's running such large budget deficit and current account deficit as that of the US. And the only reason why the U.S. can get away with it is only because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. So in other words, if the world were to suddenly move away from the dollar as a reserve currency, okay, you will see probably a financial crisis in the U.S. There's no doubt. I mean, that's why Trump says, if we lose the dollar's reserve currency status, it's like losing a war. There's no doubt. Because the US has enjoyed this huge privilege as the as the basically as the hegemon of the system. And now I am new deal. Like me again, it's understandable. Like because the US enjoys this privilege, okay, the exorbitant privilege that Charles basically call it. It's understandable other countries would like to see a piece of the action. Why should this be a US privilege? So this is why countries like China, Russia, Brazil, India, whatever, South Africa, all these countries, everybody would like to basically get a piece of, maybe the piece of a cake. And then what has been going on in the US in the last 10 years has been trying to push everybody back. And this is the reason why, these countries have decided, you know what, we're never going to basically get this thing done. While the US, because the US has a clear incentive to protect its hegemony, because, at the end of the day, again, this is not about right or wrong. This is about essentially, we live in a dog-eat-dog world. I mean, and then, as Graham Allison, professor at Harvard, famously basically coined the phrase, the Thucydides trap. He went over the last, 1,000 years and came up with 24 scenarios in which you actually, when essentially an existing hegemon is being challenged by an upstart, there's always 9 out of 10 times this leads to war. It just is that simple because how else can it be? So from that point of view, I think that's what it is. And that's just human nature. And that's real politics. The only interest I have is who's a good chess player, who's a bad chess player. And right now, I would say that the US is actually being, outplayed a little bit. And I think that is my biggest concern to the extent that, when the hegemon is actually playing the chess badly, it may overreact. When it overreacts, that's when you get war. And then a big war, okay? Because then you've got nothing to lose.
A bigger war? Does that mean more participants? Does that mean China getting involved directly? Does that mean Russia getting involved directly?
I think this is why Iran is very, very interesting, right? I mean, because I would think that China and Russia have a very strong incentive to keep Iran in this fight, okay? And of course, because the whole idea here is that Iran, if it can, Iran believes that it can win if this turns into a war of attrition, right? Because Trump doesn't have the staying power because, this is an unpopular war in the United States. They're already running out of money. This is why Pete Hegseth had to go in Congress today asking for more money, which he probably is going to struggle to get. So they believe that if you can just basically, play this game long enough, the U.S. is going to quit. So I think from that point of view, again, it's hard to say this, but literally, like as good Israel is in what it does and in the US, they are up against Russia and China. And then, and there's no doubt, I think in the realm of military, I think the Russian and the Chinese I've accomplished a great deal, even with much less money spent. Okay. The biggest problem, I think, with the US, as we discover in this war so far, is that the US spends $1 trillion a year on defense and have very little to show for. In fact, other countries that spend much less on defense actually, have actually pretty good stuff when it comes to. And then the problem with the US is that the most influential arm of the United States is the military industrial complex. These are the people who make $1 trillion a year by getting US government to sign big checks for expensive projects that are not necessarily the most effective in times of war. And this is the reason why I think one person who's probably looking at the situation and feeling vindicated is probably Elon Musk. Elon Musk thought that the F-35 is a useless piece of basically plane, which I have to tend to agree with. He thinks that we should, in general, move towards drones. He thinks the next generation war is going to be fought very differently. Of course, he left the government because he thought that, there was that the military industrial complex might actually kill him. And he was worried about the life of his mother, actually. So I think from that point of view, this is what this is about. It's about, So I think this is
Well,
what
okay. I mean, that is a conspiracy theory. I'm not even going to pull on that thread, but yes, there was a conspiracy theory that the military-industrial complex may have made some threats against Elon Musk, and that may have impacted some decisions. He is, of course, the wealthiest man in the world, so probably has ways to defend himself. We're not even going to pull on that thread for now, David, because I do want to bring it back to the dollar, and I do want to bring it back to gold, because this war, as we've said, is potentially also largely about dollar dominance. And this also comes at a time where we've seen countries de-dollarize, where we've seen central banks buying gold at record levels, where we've seen countries now hold more gold than they do US dollar-denominated assets. And yet, the dollar is up and gold is down, as of right now, I believe around 13% since the start of this war. We'll get into silver. But gold has been positioned as a neutral reserve asset because of all of these actions and reckless fiscal policies of the United States and pushback against excessive weaponization of the dollar that we saw during the Ukraine-Russia war with kicking Russia off the SWIFT system. And this whole sentiment that you got into earlier about how the BRICS plus are feeling resentful towards dollar hegemony, and they have been accruing gold. And yet, right now, gold is not only not reacting as a safe haven as it usually does during geopolitical strife, but it's down. It's down nearly 13%. What is going on with gold?
I think there are a couple of reasons for this, because we can sit here all day and talk about what gold is supposed to do and this and this and that. The reality is this. I mean, I would say, if you look at 2025, for example, right, most of the well-established gold correlations all broke down. So, like, for example, the gold oil correlation broke down. Oil price collapsed last year, gold kept going higher. Last year, the dollar went down a little bit, but gold went through the roof. Last year, real interest rates actually went up a bit, and gold went up too, okay? The only gold correlation that did not break down last year was the gold equity correlation, which is a relatively new correlation. Last year was like, well, the stock market goes up, gold goes up. Stock market goes down, gold goes down. Now, it's actually ironic because this correlation used to be a negative correlation before COVID, okay? Because it used to be the case when stock markets fall, that's when you buy gold because there's a safe haven, this and that. But since COVID, these gold and stocks have sported a positive correlation. Let me tell you why. The reason is very simple, because since COVID, US retail investors have been getting more and more involved directly into financial markets. And what do US retail investors buy? They buy the Magnificent Seven and they buy gold. And this is the reason why the two have been trading with a positive correlation. A lot has to do with the fact that retail investors buy gold and they buy the Magnificent Seven. And I think from that point of view, recently, one of the reasons why gold has been struggling is because, stock market has been struggling. Okay. And I think from that point of view, so that means that retail investors are losing money on their stock portfolio. So they're probably selling some gold. They're simply not buying more gold because they have less money to basically buy gold with. On top of that, the fact that interest rates have gone up, the dollar has strengthened and all that, I think that has also basically make it more difficult for institutional investors to add to their long gold position. So I think these are probably the main reasons, which basically begs the question, what would it take for gold to do well again? I personally think, ironically, at this point for gold to do better, you actually need probably a 10-15% in the correction in the stock market. Because if the stock market goes down 10-15%, I guarantee you everybody is going to start to really worry about, a potential US slowdown. And that's when the Federal Reserve is going to start cutting interest rates. That's when bond yields will start going down. That's when the dollar is going to peak and start going down. And probably that will be the environment in which gold will probably finally find its level. But I think that's what I think.
So gold is going to follow the stock market here. But what about the bigger picture? What about the bigger picture in terms of this conflict and the two ways that it can play out? Because if you, as you say, suggest that this does expose that the US is not as military powerful as we are led to believe, regardless of how successful this intervention is, which may happen with that ground assault, what are the two scenarios of how this war plays out, and how does that impact gold and the dollar?
Right. I think that's a very good question. I think that, it's difficult for me to see I think longer term, I'm bullish gold. There's no doubt, because the reason I'm bullish gold is because I think this power struggle between the unipolar world versus the multipolar world is very bullish for gold. Because at the end of the day, I don't believe that there will be a BRICS currency anytime soon. Simply because the BRICS currency, by definition, will require some kind of monetary union, which is never going to happen. However, BRICS, basically, the multipolar world wants to promote gold as reserve currency. That much, there is no question. And just to put it into perspective, right? In the 1960s, before this whole, U.S., basically rule-based order became firmly established, gold was 60% of global foreign exchange reserves. And then, but after the U.S. and in the last 50 years, the gold holding has been steadily going down. If we were to just go back to, right now, we're like 20%, let's just say 20% of global reserves is held in gold versus 60% in the 1960s when the whole rule-based system was not firmly established. If we would just go halfway there, gold will be much higher than where it is today. There's no doubt about it. I think on a medium-term basis, gold should be going higher simply because I think that this power struggle is not going to stop. It's not like tomorrow either China or the U.S. is going to basically call it quits. They're going to be at this for a very long time. And that is bullish gold. There's just no doubt about that because one way or the other, there is no way, especially given the fact that the U.S. is losing ground in many different ways. I mean, I'll give you a great example. I mean, I think that the U.S. ought not to. The only way for me, the U.S. can actually still win the race over the hegemony is by investing more in education. And what do I mean by that? Higher education used to be the real asset of the whole U.S. power economy and so on and so forth. In the latest survey, conducted by a Dutch university, which measure university rankings according to actually their research output, the most amazing thing is this. 20 years ago, okay, of the top 10 universities in the world ranked by their research output, 8 were Americans. There was not even a single Chinese university on that list. And number 1 was basically Harvard. The latest ranking shows that Harvard is now dropped to 3rd place, and now 8 of the top 10 are Chinese universities. So when the Chinese are taking over, university rankings, that means this is a huge problem. And in fact, this is probably the reason why the U.S. is trying to flex its military muscles in the attempt trying to use force to actually to retain its hegemony. But be that as it may, I just think that what is going on here is that, I think, I think if Trump really wants to make America great, he should become a president of education and not a president of war. Because in war, I don't know if the U.S. is going to be able to win this one. And that's
Well,
bullish gold.
well, that's a whole other topic to unpack, emphasizing education. But look, what we do know for sure, David, is that war is inflationary. As you said, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth already asking for more money. So between the oil inflation, between the fact that we have fertilizer also not able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and that causes higher food prices. There's there's LNG that's also not getting through. There are a lot of inflationary aspects in just the defense spending itself, inflation, further currency debasement and devaluation. Regardless of the positive outcome of the war, again, do you have an outlook for gold, say by year's end, by the time this conflict wraps up, either positively or negatively? And does this also not create more distrust of the United States and reinforce the idea that there is a neutral reserve asset needed, like gold, as we've already seen China and other countries start to integrate?
I think by the end of this year, I think gold price will be higher. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. I think oil price will be lower, but gold price is probably going to be quite a bit higher. And the reason is because is this. Think about this. I can tell you right now, regardless how this war is going to end, given what has already happened, every defense contractors in Washington will be making the case that we're not spending enough money on defense. They're going to say, wow, we're only spending $1 trillion. This is why we're getting our ass kicked. We now need to spend $2 trillion. Already the U.S., as you know, spends, defense $1 trillion. I mean, if they spend that money on education, the U.S. will be much more competitive. But the irony is that the result of this war, just if it ends tomorrow, is that there will be a stronger case to be made that we need to spend more on defense, which means bigger budget deficit, which means Ultimately, that's what's going to send the dollar to its ruin one day.
So let's bring it to silver then, because silver is integral for defense and for weapon systems, for all of those drones, for all of those missiles, for all of those electronics. Silver is essential for all of that, even for the modern warfare that Elon Musk has been advocating for. And yet, silver is also down dramatically during this war. Why do you think we're not seeing silver go up here?
Because at the end of the day, like central banks, they buy gold, they don't buy silver because there's no liquidity in silver. And silver, because there's no liquidity, and then you got a bunch of retail guys pushing it up and down, is too speculative I think, for reserve managers. Whereas I'm talking about the sort of the fundamental driver of gold here, which is about reserve diversification. These are the sort of the
But in
big
terms of the military industrial complex, in terms of the industrial uses for, and I get your case for gold, I'm not disputing that necessarily, but in terms of silver, silver is needed for all of these weapon systems, for all of these missiles. You're saying that there's going to be a need for higher defense. Silver is essential for that. And yet, you're saying that the U.S. is depleting its munitions, that interceptors are running low, which would make sense considering how this war is going on. You're saying that this is a war of attrition, try to get the U.S. and Israel and perhaps whoever else joins this war to deplete its supplies. Isn't that potentially bullish for silver? If not now, then when those munitions need to be replenished?
Yeah, I think I don't know enough about. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on how much silver is being used in the arms industry, but I do know that silver, for example, is a very important, actually, component for chips and for data centers. I mean, this is why the whole AI capex spending has been accompanied by a surge in silver price. But it's also true that actually, I do think that the whole AI trade is very long in the teeth. And I think, that I actually think that, what's happening this is a different story altogether. The news over the past week out of, Meta and XAI about how they have fallen behind in terms of, the race in LLM, all that basically, I personally think that another big surprise coming to the market is that I think the $600 billion market is basically baked in terms of capex spending in data centers this year. I'll be very surprised that we get anywhere close in terms of that figure, and that I don't know to what that definitely would not be that bullish for silver.
Fair point there. But again, negative for the markets overall. Are there any sectors that you think do well in this environment? Any
I think
particular picks?
I think the sectors that would do well. It's hard because I think the way I'm trading this, I'm being very opportunistic. And then this is why, like, it's sort of like my time horizons may be very different than people who are listening to this podcast, whatever it is. Like, generally speaking, for example, I would do something like if Trump tomorrow were to, for example, announce essentially a control of U.S. oil export, for example, right? You would be looking to sell the U.S. oil majors and buy consumer discretionary. Something I'm actually toiling about. Maybe I should get ahead of him because this is something that it's not impossible to happen. Right. I do think that, as defense stocks have been struggling lately. But if because where's the money going to come from? But if there's any more setback, I think in terms of the U.S., if it takes another week or two to even get anywhere, obviously U.S. should win this war. I mean, it's, but again, you think about how much money Iran spends on defense versus what U.S. spends on defense, it's a joke. The U.S. hasn't been able to run over Iran already by now. But the point here is that any hiccup should be basically seen as actually an opportunity to buy U.S. defense stocks for the reason I just said before. That any setback will be seen as an argument for spending even more. So I think I think defense actually, if it goes down anymore, I think it becomes very interesting.
Is that the only sector? I mean, how do you see some of the oil-related stocks?
I think the oil stuff is probably overbought in my view. Because I think one way or the other, this thing is going to play out. When it does, oil prices are going to collapse. And especially given the fact, whichever way it goes, let's just say the U.S. loses tacos, I think oil price is probably going to collapse. So there are a lot of ways oil price is going to come in. That's why I don't like the whole oil stock story. I mean, I'm long oil. I mean, basically, because I don't think this is going to happen in the next week or two. Maybe we'll get squeezed higher. I'll take profit and then get out and so on and so forth. But the point here is that right now it's difficult to see. I mean, I think honestly, I think we've seen big rotations over the last 3 weeks. We've seen rotation out of international equities back into U.S. equities. Within U.S. equities, we've seen rotations out of, essentially the sort of the cyclical names like industrials into, let's say, utilities and in tech. But now I think everybody's back to sort of neutral weighting. I suspect the next rotation is going to be back into cash. And this is why I'm bearish on stocks. And then if we do get that, I'm thinking about, I think you're going to see, I think you're going to see across the board. I think you're going to see a correlation across all sectors, and it'd be very difficult to see winners. I think bonds will become, essentially benefit from safe haven flows. But right now, I don't want to basically get too cute about which sector I want to be looking to buy and so on and so forth. I just think that you want to be very defensive here. But you've got to basically pick, things that you like that you will be looking to buy when they fall. But for me, it's not going to be about a certain level at which you buy them at, but rather what is the trigger here? That's what it is. And for me, a trigger, obviously, either Trump talk. I mean, for me to buy is obviously if Trump were to taco tomorrow, then the stock market's going to go up 5-10% easily. Ironically, even though it will be very bearish for the U.S. longer term, but if he tacos, the stock market will go up, right? Or that, if all of a sudden you see that Israel and, in the U.S. started to call on Iranian people to go to the streets, that the market could potentially see that as a positive simply because they think that they're confident that this can actually work before they do that. So I'm just saying that there are a lot of different hints that we're going to be on the lookout for in terms of how to trade the market.
Well, before we get to your book, big picture here, David, is there a scenario where this does work out in Washington and in the Trump administration's favor? Is there a version of events where it does play out, where the U.S. successfully completes the operation in a way that sends a clear signal to China and Russia and other geopolitical rivals that American military power and strategic reach is intact, perhaps even unmatched? Could they open up the Strait of Hormuz, thereby disrupting China's ability to get cheap oil from Iran? Could they also reinforce dollar dominance in terms of energy trade? In other words, push oil settlements back towards the dollar, slow down that reverse that we've seen with other countries trying to experiment and, in fact, enact in non-dollar oil transactions? Could it work out well and serve as a broader geopolitical message, a demonstration that the U.S. still has the capacity and the willingness to project power, secure all of these strategic pathways, deter adversaries, enforce red lines? Again, this is the most optimistic case, but if that happens, and again, to your point, it could even lead to a political transformation inside Iran itself, with a weakening of the current regime and perhaps an emergence of a government more aligned with the West. If that does happen, the positive scenario from the Trump administration's perspective stabilizes the region, oil supply back into global markets, push energy prices lower, reinforce the perception that the United States remains the dominant global superpower, reinforce the petrodollar system. How realistic is that outcome, where this entire operation does end up strengthening the U.S. geopolitical power and hegemony?
Like every outcome obviously carries some probability. I'm not saying that this outcome you just outlined carries zero probability. I think probably I would not give it more than 25% chance.
It's pretty high.
And I think, for whatever it's worth. I mean, and again, there's nothing against Trump. I just think it's a very difficult thing. If he actually achieves this, he would deserve the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. He will go down in history as one of the greatest U.S. president ever. There's no doubt. And I'm sure that's probably motivating him. He's thinking that, wow, it'll be amazing if I can get this thing done. If there's anybody who can get it done, you could argue it will be Donald Trump, actually, because, for the talents that he brings to the table. But I think it will be very tough. I think the most likely outcome, by the way, even if they manage to destroy the regime, is that you're probably going to end up with a civil war in Iran. Okay, you're probably going to end up all the leaders of the revolutionary guards. They're going to retreat back to their provinces and become warlords by seizing strategic assets and so on and so forth. But I think for the U.S. standpoint, I think that's probably not a bad outcome either, because if the objective here is to devalue, okay, Iran as a strategic asset for China, Iran going to a civil war could actually deliver the same outcome. So I think I don't think the U.S. cares about the Iranian people, whether they're going to have democracy or not. When Trump went into Venezuela to pull, Maduro out, he was not thinking that he's going to basically promote democracy in Venezuela. He's just trying to get his hand on the Venezuela oil. The same thing with Iran. If you cannot have it, then basically destroy it completely. And then I think that's to me is an easier outcome, and maybe that's what we're going to end up.
Okay, a lot of unknowns, so clearly hard to analyze things as we see how things play out. But what we do know is that you have released an excellent new book. Merry-Go-Round broke down a fictional story set inside the world of global finance, but rooted in real-world dynamics. So, David, tell us a little bit about your book as we wrap up here.
Yeah, so basically, listen, I mean, I worked on Wall Street for 30 years, and my wife was always very embarrassed, okay, about my profession. Every time she had to introduce me, like, she's to introduce me, oh, my husband basically is in the business of helping rich people get richer, right? I mean, so like I always felt, so I therefore, when I finally retired, I said, well, I'm going to do something for everybody. Okay. And I'm doing a lot of different things. But one thing I sort of feel like, that my career on Wall Street has been an incredible, essentially journey to the extent is basically taking me everywhere in the world. I've traveled over 100 countries, like I read a team that was responsible for the forecast of over 100 countries for Bank of America, so I met a lot of people. I think I have a very, very interesting insight into the workings of the world. And I kind of feel like I wanted to share that with everybody. Okay. Now, of course, I could have sat down and write a book about another policy, history book, whatever it is, but that would be boring. Also, because I wanted to write a novel that will make what I know accessible to everybody. Because at the end of the day, there is a human face involved here. My story is about how the world spun out of control. My protagonists are not just hedge fund manager, bankers, but they're also housewives, illegal workers, blue collar workers, people of all stripes. Because in the end, I think what I want people to understand is that globalization left nobody untouched anywhere. We're all culprits in one way or the other. We're all benefits. We're all basically losers in some ways. So from that point of view, the book is really an exploration of the butterfly effect of globalization, how actions of people in one quarter can ripple across continents and have massive impact on other people, good or bad. And so from that point of view, I want to really bring that drama to everybody, because I think at this particular juncture of our history together, it's very important that everybody understands what we're dealing with, especially given if we're going to throw away globalization. I just want to basically make sure we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I want to make that journey of learning, partaking in my experience as fun as possible. That's why this is a financial thriller. I think it's a great read, and we got an incredible review by a lot of people. All the pre-release book reviews gotten 5 stars, 5 star, 5 stars. People sort of feel like this is a very refreshing account about the world from, again, an extra Wall Street guy. But obviously, but also I just want to say, I want to acknowledge my co-author is my wife, Marguerite Chenard. She's an architect by training. We travel around the world. The book is set over 10 years in 10 countries. And, it will be coming out in 11 days. It's already available for pre-orders, all the major U.S. booksellers from Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and everything else. I would really appreciate people read the book and give me their honest feedback.
Well, I usually do read the books ahead of interviewing someone. I did not get a chance to read your book, but I promise you I will, and I will have you back on to talk about the book and also to talk about how your forecasts are developing here in this very volatile geopolitical landscape. But David, thank you very much. We really appreciate you spending this time with us and sharing your insights and your perspective. David Woo, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
And as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoy our content, find it informative, educational, interesting, which we hope you do, and we hope it's all of the above, please make sure to share it with friends and family, and please subscribe. And if you'd like to learn more about building a precious metal strategy, you can reach out to info@milesfranklin.com. We have a team of specialized advisors and brokers that can guide you. And if you mention my name, they'll give you an extra special deal. Also, check out our website, milesfranklin.com. In the meantime, please leave us your comments. Feel free to praise, whine, or just opine. We do read them, and we love hearing from you. From me, Michelle Makori, and the rest of the team, we will see you soon. Until then, stay sovereign.
This is The Real Story with Michelle Makori.